Page 10. The mind doesn't work that way. Jerry Fodor, 2001. The Scope and Limits of Computational Psychology. Chapter 1. Varieties of Nativism. 1.1 Chomsky's Nativism. The present phase of nativistic theorizing about the cognitive mind began with two suggestions of Noam Chomsky's, that there are substantive, universal constraints on the kinds of grammars that natural languages can have, and that these constraints express correspondingly substantive and universal properties of human psychology, determined, presumably, by the characteristic genetic endowment of our species. In effect, Chomsky predicted the convergence of two lines of research. 1. On the one hand, empirical investigation of the range of grammatical structures that human languages exhibit would estimate the limits within which it is possible for them to vary. One then subtracts the ways that human languages can differ from the ways in which it is conceivable that languages could differ. The remainder after the subtraction is the set of linguistic universals that implicitly define possible human language. Note 1. This is the nomological sense of possible. The idea is that, given the laws of human psychology, there are conceptually possible languages that couldn't be the native language of a human speaker, hearer. 2. On the other hand, empirical investigations of the conditions under which children learn to talk would estimate the information their linguistic environments provide, hence how much poverty of the stimulus the language learning process tolerates. One then subtracts the information that is in the environment from the information that is required for the child to achieve linguistic mastery. The remainder after the subtraction is what the child's innate knowledge contributes to the language acquisition process. If everything goes well, it should turn out that what the child innately knows will be the same universal principles that constrain the humanly possible languages. Such a convergence would explain, in one stroke, both why human languages don't differ arbitrarily and also why, pace occasional sentimental claims on behalf of dolphins and chimpanzees, only human beings seem to be any good at learning them. In principle, the research strategy that Chomsky proposed seems perfectly straightforward to execute. One need only determine the empirical values of the relevant parameters, perform the indicated subtractions, and then compare the remainders. So why, you might wonder, didn't somebody just get a grant and do it? In practice that turned out not to be easy. For one thing, it's not easy for cognitive scientists to get grants if they are working on questions of any theoretical interest. To ensure this is a main function of the institution of peer review, and, for another thing, even rational people can disagree about how much, and in what ways, languages actually differ and about whether the residual similarities might after all be explained away without resort to nativistic postulations, perhaps by appealing to historical or environmental factors, or to the functional properties that any language would need to have if it is to be expressive and efficient. Likewise, it is no small matter to figure out what information the child's linguistic environment makes available to the acquisition process, or how much of what it makes available the child actually exploits, or how much of what the child actually exploits he could have done without, consonant with achieving normal fluency by the normal means. One can't, of course, perform Kasper-Hauser experiments on the offspring of one's conspecifics. So the argument that Chomsky started all those years ago continues unabated. I assume its general outlines are familiar, and I won't rehearse them further here. What's most striking for our purposes is a point about his view that Chomsky has himself often emphasized, insofar as it concerns the relation between human language and human nature. His position is continuous with indeed, practically indistinguishable from a one that philosophical rationalists have defended for centuries. Except for the characteristically modern identification of human nature with what the human genotype specifies, Chomsky's ideas about innateness would have been intelligible to Plato, and they would have been intelligible in much the terms of the present debate. This is because Chomsky's nativism is primarily a thesis about knowledge and belief. It aligns problems in the theory of language with those in the theory of knowledge. Indeed, as often as not, the vocabulary in which Chomsky frames linguistic issues is explicitly epistemological. Thus, the grammar of a language specifies what its speaker, hearers have to know, qua speakers and hearers, and the goal of the child's language acquisition process is to construct a theory of the language that correctly expresses this grammatical knowledge. Likewise, the central problem of language acquisition arises from the poverty of the primary linguistic data from which the child effects this construction, and the proposed solution of the problem is that much of the knowledge that linguistic competence depends on is available to the child a priori, that is, prior to learning. Everything I've put in italics belongs to the epistemologist's vocabulary. It is, to repeat, primarily epistemological nativism that Chomsky shares with the rationalists. When Plato asks what the slave boy knows about geometry, and where on earth he could have learned it, it really is much the same question that Chomsky asks about what speaker, hearers know about their language and where on earth they could have learned that. There is, I think, no equivocation on the key terms. Note 2. To be sure, Chomsky's official doctrine is that talk about knowing grammars would be replaced by explicitly neologistic talk about cognizing them in a properly sanitized formulation of his views. This is because he wants, quite properly, to avoid the implication that learning a language is acquiring justified beliefs. For that matter, he wants to avoid the implication that learning a language is acquiring beliefs at all, and so far as the identity of one's beliefs is constituted not just by their content but also by, for example, their decision-theoretic relations to one's utilities, but none of this is germane to the point in the text, which is that cognizing, like believing and knowing, is bona fide intentional. Since cognizing is a propositional attitude, Chomsky's nativism, like Plato's and Descartes', is a nativism of propositional attitudes. That is what connects Chomsky to rationalist epistemology. For further discussion along these lines, see Fodor 1983. By contrast, new synthesis psychological theories of the kind that Pinker and Plotkin espouse are typically about not epistemic states but cognitive processes, for example, the mental processes involved in thinking, learning, and perceiving. The key idea of new synthesis psychology is that cognitive processes are computational, and the notion of computation thus appealed to borrows heavily from the foundational work of Alan Turing. A computation, according to this understanding, is a formal operation on syntactically structured representations. Accordingly, a mental process, qua computation, is a formal operation on syntactically structured mental representations. We'll return to this idea quite soon and at length. Suffice it, for the moment, that whereas Chomsky's rationalism consists primarily in nativism about the knowledge that cognitive capacities manifest, new synthesis rationalism consists primarily in nativism about the computational mechanisms that exploit such knowledge for the purposes of cognition. To put it in a nutshell, what's new about the new synthesis is mostly the consequence of conjoining a rationalist epistemology with a syntactic notion of mental computation. The attempt to ground psychology in the idea that mental processes are computations is a main topic of the discussion to follow. I'm mostly interested in telling you what I think is right about this idea and what I think isn't. But first I have to tell you how it's supposed to work. This will take some fairly extended exegesis. Please do bear with me. Unlike epistemic nativism, computational nativism really is a new kind of rationalist theory. Whereas Plato would have understood Chomsky well enough, I doubt that he would have understood Turing at all. Page 13.